This is Amy, and you're listening to the Talkin' Appalachian podcast. Welcome to Season 4 of the Talkin' Appalachian podcast. And if you've been a listener from the beginning, well, thank you for staying here with me. If you're new, welcome, and I hope after this episode you'll want to go back and catch up with Seasons 1 to 3. We're getting this season started with Dr. Valerie Fridland to talk about her new book, Why We Talk Funny, the real story behind our accents. If that doesn't sound like the perfect guest for this podcast, I don't know who is. I read this book almost in one sitting and then read it again. If you're into language and accents in particular, you will love this episode and you'll love her book because it takes a deep dive into the histories of accents, why people, quote, talk funny, and how they've used accents for centuries to either empower themselves or judge others. We'll also clear up some rumors about the differences between accent and slang, why we sound the way we do in Appalachia, and how standard English became the dialect that we prescribe in our schools and other institutions. This is one of the most interesting episodes I've done, and Valerie Fridland truly turned out to be a kindred spirit. She's originally from the South, so she understands what it means to speak a regional accent, and why our words and the way we say them and arrange them in sentences is so important to so many of us. So let me tell you a little bit more about Valerie Fridland. She's a professor of linguistics in the English department at the University of Nevada, Reno, which I learned to say correctly, and the author of Like Literally Dude, Arguing for the Good in Bad English, and of course, Why We Talk Funny, the real story behind our accents, which is what we're going to talk about today. She's a 2-time National Endowment for the Humanities Fellow. She's a recipient of the Linguistic Society of America's Linguistics, Language, and Public Award. And she focuses on how social changes and the forces of language and our psychologies tend to reshape our language over time, which affects how we talk to each other and how we think about each other. She is a regular guest on lots of podcasts. I listened to her on a podcast with Alan Alda, a podcast with Dax Shepard. She's been on the Grammar Girls several times. She's appeared as a language expert on NPR, NBC, for the Washington Post, the New York Post, the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times. So she's widely recognized, but she's also really down home and turned out to be a kindred spirit by the end of this podcast. So I'm really glad to know her now and excited that I'll probably have her back on the podcast in the future. If you haven't already, would you subscribe to the Talkin' Appalachian podcast on YouTube? It's a great way to share, like, and comment on the podcast, which helps me educate more people about our fascinating region and its dialects. All right, it's time to put your earbuds in or turn up the volume in your car because you're going to love this episode. Welcome to Season 4 with Dr. Valerie Fridland.
I had to tell you, I love your podcast. It's a joy to listen to you. You know, I don't actually listen to podcasts a lot, which is funny because I'm on them a lot, but yours I could listen to all day long. First of all, I think it reminds me of home, partially. Like, I just love listening to Southern accents, for one, but I also just, your topics are fascinating. It's such a beautiful story you tell all the time. I really, really adore your podcast. So I'm a big fan.
Thank you. That means more than you could possibly know. You know what you're talking about, and I love this book so much. I've read it 3 times already.
I'm so flattered.
Well, I'm just tickled to death to have you with us and scared we won't get through it all. But if we don't, just have you back on.
I'd love to come back. I'll just love talking about this stuff. And you touch on in your podcast so many things that are part of why I do this work. And, I could talk all day, and I think you could too. So we're in trouble.
I just wanted to start with why you were inspired to write Why We Talk Funny, and who were you thinking about when you wrote it? I know you come from an interesting linguistic background, and I just listened to a podcast with Dax Shepard where you talk about your father, which is a fascinating story, and your mother was French Canadian.
I come from a very, I like to call myself a linguistic mutt because I come from a very diverse linguistic background. But I grew up in the South, in Memphis, Tennessee. But my parents were actually not American. They came to the United States in the 70s. I'm dating myself here. And my father was Belgian, but he was actually a Holocaust survivor. So early on, about when he was about 12, he ended up in Israel at a orphanage there in a kibbutz. So he also spoke Yiddish as well and learned English, but French was his first language. And then my mother was French Canadian, so French was her first language. And they moved to the U.S. for work. My father was a scientist, and he took a job at a hospital in Memphis. And it was kind of culture shock for them, I think, especially at that time. There weren't a lot of non-native English speakers there, at least not they ran into very often. And then I was, of course, born there or, raised there. And I went to school with a bunch of Southerners who were my peer group. And of course, you end up speaking like your peer group, which is why when you're born to non-native speakers in a different country, you end up speaking whatever is spoken around you in that country and don't sound like your parents. So I certainly don't have a French accent. But every once in a while, when I was really young, some of their accent would creep in to my speech. So, for example, in French, you don't have H's. You don't pronounce words with an initial H like we do in English. And so I was talking about a teddy bear I had at school that was huge. It was this really cool teddy bear. I still think it was a cool teddy bear, even to this day. And it was like 3 feet tall. So I was like, it was huge. And of course, I wasn't a New Yorker. So that didn't work. But it was the French influence on my pronunciation of huge. And it was like my friends' heads spun around. I mean, you would have thought I walked in naked. That noticeable. So, I felt sort of shunned because people were like, you talk funny. And that's actually where that phrase comes from, is because I've noticed that when people talk differently than we do, we often call what they sound like funny. You sound funny. They sound kind of funny. And it's a weird word because I don't necessarily think we always mean it in a negative way, but it's not a lovely word to call someone's speech because it really is an outsider word, right? When you call someone funny. So my parents sounded funny and I sounded funny. And I lived in a place where other people thought everybody who lived there sounded funny, with the Southern accent. And so I think I just had a whole lot of accent angst in my early life that kind of set me up to become a linguist later in life. I didn't actually realize how it would sort of manifest in my day job until I went to college and took a linguistics class. And I think you've had this experience as someone who knows linguistics. It all of a sudden puts a story to all these different things you've felt, you've experienced, you've not understood, or you've wondered about how language works, why it works that way, why we feel so deeply tied to it in many ways, what it tells us about other people and ourselves. And I think, it was just like that moment of crystallization for me sitting in that class as a sophomore. And it was like, damn, this is interesting. I got to learn more about this. And then it was a slow creep to the point where I got a PhD. And what happened there that really made me want to write in this book, particularly, I've obviously done a lot of linguistics work more generally, is that I have a very faint Southern accent. And I've never had a very strong one, but I'm not very different than a lot of people in my generation that were born in urban centers in the South. We can talk about that, but there's definitely an atrophy of the Southern urban accent. And people kept telling me how Southerners were supposed to sound outside the South. And they would tell me these things that were both wrong and also not valid to my experience. Because I went to school in Michigan for my doctorate, and they have their own accent thing going on up in Michigan. And so I just wanted to set the record straight, both about what Southern is, what Southern sounds like, and accents more generally. And also that, people that don't live there can't tell me what a Southern accent's like. I think it was a little bit of rebellion in me, like, no, that's not what it is. I'm going to explain what it is because there's so much misinformation out there about what accents are, and especially about accents that set you apart from others in noticeable ways, because everybody has an accent, but a lot of people don't think they do. But if you were born in the South, accents are part of your daily life and this knowledge that other people think you sound funny. And so this book was really inspired by the young life experience, my college life experience, and then finally, as a linguist, this idea that I wanted to get the right information out there so I could combat some of these sort of prejudicial stereotypes that exist.
That's exactly why I started this podcast about what English is. For the very same,
I know, we're kindred spirits.
We are kindred spirits because a college class set me on my course and lots of similarities there. So we're going to talk about what people misunderstand about accents, but maybe we should start by defining the difference between a dialect and an accent and slang, because people like to call it slang too. So can you differentiate?
I tell them, I start every class I have with my students in the fall with, let's go over these terms because people use them interchangeably a lot of times. And it's really important because part of this tendency to sort of use them for the same thing is because we think of accents as somehow decayed. And so slang is also decayed and dialect is kind of decayed. So we're just going to lump them all together. But, there are two crucial things to know is that none of them are in any way decay. Everybody has an accent, everybody has a dialect, and everybody sometimes uses slang. But they're also distinct in terms of what they refer to. So a dialect is differences among, speech of a group compared to another group that varies on multiple levels. So that can be in vocabulary. So whether I say Coke, pop, or soda, for example, could be a dialectal difference. It could also be syntax. So, one thing we're probably going to talk about is the use of we was instead of we were. That would be a syntactic difference or a morphosyntactic difference. So something to do with how you structure sentences. Another seminal Southern example is might could, the double middle construction. So that's a part of dialect. And then it also can vary on sounds. So whether I merge my pin and pen vowel, that would be a sort of phonological feature. So the level of sound. So a dialect is all of those things. So when you vary on more than one level, you're having a dialectal difference. An accent only refers to the level of sound. But what's interesting is that seems to be the most salient level for us. So people are incredibly quick to judge on accents. It might take you a while to get a syntactic structure that you notice, and so that you wouldn't call someone out on it. But within 400 milliseconds, so about the time it takes you to say hello, we are already judging someone on their accent. And that doesn't mean we're negative about it. We make evaluations like, are they male or female? How young or old they are? Are they black or white? Those are the types of things we get. Also, whether they're foreign or native, all of that we can do pretty accurately within 400 milliseconds. Now, we often go on stereotypes. So we're not always accurate, but we do it automatically. And so I feel like for me, one of the things that I think people talk to me the most about is the way people pronounce things. And so that was always an interest to me. I think a lot of Southern differences are on all levels. So Southern dialect is, of course, an interesting area to study. But for me, the Southern accent was what always fascinated me because I loved some of the features because they're remarkably complex. So a lot of the phonology of Southern speech is incredibly complex and really hard to learn if you're not from that area. And, like I monetization, like right and ride, that's actually a very complex rule. People don't understand when you just hear someone say it as a Southern speaker. Mm-hmm. But if you move to the South, that's a really complex rule to pick up because it's very finely detailed in how it operates from a linguistic level. So I'm kind of a nerd in that way, and I really love getting deep into the details of phonology, and I think that's what attracted me to studying accent. And then finally, just to close it out, slang is sort of the level of vocabulary, but typically something, ephemeral and short-lived that often is associated with youth culture, but not necessarily. It just tends to be that young people are more innovative in language. And they're certainly more innovative with vocabulary use. They pick it up from each other and sort of creatively repurpose words in ways that a lot of times older adults consider sort of non-conforming usage. And that would be slang. That would typically be slang. So just using a different word than someone else isn't slang, but using a word that's kind of short-lived and trendy and often young, that would be considered slang.
And if you want to know if it's slang, I have a 16-year-old and an 18-year-old. So if you try to say what they're saying and they're like, don't ever say that again, you know that it's slang.
You have my same children, clearly. Yes, I have an 18-year-old daughter. My son is actually pretty tolerant of my language stuff, But my daughter, she's just like, I don't want to ever hear that out enough again. Never. But I can't help but try it because it's so much fun. But yes, it's probably not the way to be cool to your kids.
When you study language and you have teenagers, it's a fascinating study of language to listen to them and to listen to how quickly things come and go. You know, my daughter, it's monthly. I'll hear something and it'll go for about a month or 2 months and then it changes.
Oh, absolutely. And then I don't know.
Now we're saying this today. Okay.
If you hear it actually live and in action, but you're absolutely right. It changes weekly, monthly, you know, and then you bring up something. She's like, I never said that. And I said, I have evidence. I know you did.
Exactly.
That's great. They're great for data collection.
They are. And when you're talking about the different aspects of dialect and accent being the one that is hardest to change or hardest to pick up on, or hard not to pick up on, but if you were to move to a new area. I was talking about this just the other evening that, you know, I standardized my grammar because I teach and I have to be a role model, you know, so I've leveled my grammar and for the most part, unless I'm around my family, I use words that basically anybody would use for things. But my accent is the hardest thing to change, the way that I pronounce my words, that the light and bright. And I think if I tried to change that, it would feel so foreign to me. I would feel I wouldn't be myself. You know, that's never going to change about me, I don't think.
It would be very inauthentic. I think it would feel inauthentic.
Yes.
I think that's sort of why I'm fascinated by that level of sound, of accent rather than dialect. I mean, I love dialect features too. Don't get me wrong. I'd be happy to study those as well. But my personal fascination, I think, with accent is because it's so unconscious and sort of not under your subjective control in many ways. And it's so incredibly pervasive because if you think about it, that you might say a word once a day or twice a day or maybe even 15 times a day, right? If it's a word like V. But you say a sound probably 1,000 times a day. So if you say that sound differently than another group, then 1,000 times a day, you're going to sound different than them. And so I think that's what you're kind of referring to there. You might be able to change it in this, for, you know, one case where you're paying attention to changing how you're pronouncing a word. But say it's a vowel sound that's different. That vowel's in so many different words, and you can't possibly control for that while you're talking because you wouldn't ever have a conversation.
Right.
You'd be too busy trying to control for it. It's not like an actor who has a script and they can actually write notes to themselves and they just have to be on set for 10 hours a day doing it and they take breaks. That's not how life works. And it would be completely inauthentic to not just you, but also, I think, to a listener, because it would kind of go back and forth. You wouldn't catch all of them, and then it would sound really kind of creepy or weird. And if anybody's ever met someone who puts on a Southern accent when they go to the South, you know, I had a friend in college whose sister used to do that. She would come visit, and then for weeks afterwards, she'd have this faux Southern accent that drove me nuts. And part of it's because she would change some things, but not all things. And so it was this really uneven replication of the accent. But yes, sounds are the hardest thing to replicate. You can get a word with them, you know, so you can start saying, like in Philly, they say water as wooder. I could walk around saying, I want some wooder. That's just one word with that vowel, but I couldn't do it in every word that vowel might be pronounced that way, actually.
So many of you have joined the Talkin' Appalachian community on Patreon, and I just want to welcome you. If you're thinking of subscribing to get bonus episodes, writing, my travel logs for places and spaces I visit throughout Appalachia, or anything else I only share with subscribers, then go on over to patreon.com/Talkin' Appalachian Podcast. And if you choose to become a paid subscriber, that will unlock bonus episodes with literary luminaries like Barbara Kingsolver, Homer Hickam, and Jeanette Walls, my interview with an Appalachian Holocaust survivor, and some absolutely true ghost tales from my own family's vault. You'll also have early access to episodes like this one before they're published. Talkin' Appalachian Podcast on Patreon.
Now, I'm in Virginia, and I'm in the Appalachian side of Virginia. And Virginia is a very complex state linguistically. Mm-hmm. I mean, you've got all the way to the east, you've got Tangier Island, which is its own incredible story.
Fabulous.
And then you've got the Appalachian side, you've got urban, you've got the metro. I want to get into this a little bit, especially with history, because my husband is from Metro Richmond, and he moved here a little over 20 years ago. So he sounds very different from me, but I feel like I can pick up on some things that are changing about his accent maybe a little bit. He works with the public, so he's working with a lot of Appalachian natives. So at what point do we start to develop an accent as kids, and can you develop one when you're in a different place as an adult, just subconsciously?
That is such a fascinating question, and it's a really complex answer because there's so many different levels at which we have to acquire the speech of a new area. But let's start with children, because they are incredibly good at acquiring accents. In fact, they are effortless at it. You don't ever think about as a parent, like, oh my God, I've got to teach them how to say this in the Southern way, or even anything about language acquisition. They just kind of pick it up, and then you ship them off to school and you're like, okay, great, you can talk. You're good. I've done my job, right? So you don't even realize that you are giving them little life lessons linguistically from birth. And in fact, an accent, really, you could argue that listening with an accent, which we all do as well as speak with one, starts before birth. When, a baby's in utero, they actually can hear the mother's voice. It's filtered through amniotic fluid, so they can't really make out individual sounds as much as the melody or intonational patterns of a language. And we find that babies just a few days old respond more to the melody of their home language, of their mother's language, than melodies of foreign languages. So they are already attuned to some aspects of accent, even before they come out, right? Which is pretty amazing. And then by 5 months old, babies will actually turn to people that have an accent like the one spoken at home, as opposed to people that sound different. And then by 10 months old, they'll actually take a toy. They prefer to take a toy from someone that sounds like them than someone who doesn't. So clearly, accent starts really, really young. But in terms of the more, sort of finite set of rules you have to acquire to speak with an accent rather than hear with an accent, children don't really start to show use of accented features until they pretty much go to school. So around 5, 6, you can hear children that start to sound like the people around them. And that's because the peer group is incredibly important to the way that children will develop an accent. We like to think of parents, we like to think of our influence going very deep and broad, but anybody who's had teenagers knows that's a fallacy. But even with young children, they actually basically learn the system of sounds from you as a parent. So they are getting input, and their brain is kind of programmed, okay, this is a sound in my language, and that's how you make an R, and oh my gosh, can I get my lips around the stupid L sound that's so tough to make? But they're not actually learning what's going to be their accent from you, most likely. That seems to happen when they go to school, where they go through something called vernacular reorganization, which is where they fixate sort of on the cool people, which is not mom and dad, and they start to sound like the people that matter to them in their social life. And not just parents matter to them, they don't matter to them in the same sort of socially significant way that a peer group does.
Yeah.
And so that's what happens. Around 4 or 5, they start attending to the differences and the linguistic differences that sort of signal those differences and start modeling it in their use. And then it particularly peaks when they're adolescent. So it's really around 12 to 17 where we see the accent they're going to have in adulthood really form. And of course, that's also where you have that intense identity formation that's going on in teenage years. And there's more, still more cognitive and neural plasticity at that point, where they can marshal these resources to kind of pick up on really subtle variations. And there's also a lot of social importance in fitting in to certain groups and in stylistically doing it. So, you dress a certain way to fit in, you talk a certain way, you go to the same sorts of activities and events, and you listen to the same sorts of music. Language is part of that whole stylistic package that you're learning. And that is really the heart and soul of our accents, is I'd say between 12 and 17. Not that parents don't teach you anything with accents. We actually see some really interesting research that shows mothers in particular, and fathers are interesting on their own right, but this has been particularly found in mothers, where they start altering their speech more towards local variants as a kid goes from 2 to 4 years old. So it's like at the very beginning, they're very hyper articulate. Mothers tend to over articulate sounds. And, you do that sort of sing-songy baby talk.
Yeah.
And then around 2 to 4, you shift into more local features so that you are sort of modeling to that child, this is a feature that might be important to you. And one really interesting thing we find is that the way that mothers talk to boys is a little different than with girls. So they actually use more local features with boys than they do with girls, which suggests they are actually kind of modeling what the expectation socially will be for those kids. So there's a lot of fascinating accent in youth things, but then once you get your main system, you're kind of locked in. So whatever you have at 18 is pretty much the system you'll have through life. But it can be altered. And so getting to that question you asked about an accent in adulthood, the common wisdom used to be, once you have an accent, you always have that accent. It's not going to change. The revised, I think, attitude of linguists that have a little more research where they've been able to do more fine sort of acoustic studies of people is that, yes, you can alter your accent, but it's quite infrequent to become native-like in the way that you'll talk. There are some people that are really good at that kind of imitation or mimicking of accent, so good that they might fool you. And there certainly is evidence that some people do that. They tend to be people that are very good at hearing musical differences, so tone, and that have musical aptitude. There also is some MRI evidence that maybe there's different brain processing at work. So those are unique individuals. For the rest of us, we're always going to have an accent. But when you move to a new place, what you do is sort of piecemeal pick up aspects of that accent, depending on how integrated you are. So are you spending a lot of times with locals? If you move to a place and you're only hanging out with other people from where you're from or outsiders, you're not going to pick up the local accent. But if you're married to someone with it and your kids have it and all your friends have that accent, then you have a good motivation and a lot of exposure that will help you acquire aspects of that accent. But like we talked about a little bit ago, it's hard to learn the perfect rules for when those certain sounds need to change because they occur 1,000 times a day. So you'll move toward that accent. We have really fascinating research that suggests that people do that, but you won't become a native-like speaker of that accent. So what you do is you sound different from those people you left behind, but you also sound different from those people that you moved to, and you get this kind of blended intermediate accent. And there was a really fascinating study done with Canadians that had moved to New York City to see if they got the New York City accent. And the study suggested that, yes, they did move in their vowels. So they started saying, more like coffee than coffee. But it was very, subtle. So when you compared them to people still living in Canada, they didn't sound like them anymore in how they pronounced words like coffee. But they didn't sound like New Yorkers either. So they had moved toward the accent, but not really accomplished the accent, if that makes sense.
Were they conscious of that, or was it something that happens without thinking?
Well, that's a really interesting question. And that was part of the study, is that maybe it's only things we notice. So it would be something that if I moved to a new area, I'd say, oh my gosh, this is how they pronounce that there. So it would be something that, you'd have to be able to notice in order to imitate and be aware of. But what that study found is it looked at 2 different features. One, which is a really complex short ass system in New York, which is way too complex to get into. But it's one of those things people are not really aware of, even though they might notice that there's a weird way people say in New York, but they wouldn't get the rule. And then there's the low back vowel merger, which they have in Canada, that most people in Canada don't know they have, and they don't realize New Yorkers don't have it. So there's really zero awareness of that. And the one thing that some people notice is that people in New York say coffee, which is actually an example of not having that back vowel merger, but people hear it as a vocabulary item rather than a, part of this larger system. But they actually found that those speakers, even though they weren't aware that that vowel existed in other words, they actually shifted even in words they wouldn't have been aware of, but they did it mostly to a greater degree in words that were highly noticeable, like coffee. So they were not necessarily aware of it, but awareness seemed to help, if that makes sense.
Now, I want to get to the shibboleth, which you talk about. And, in Appalachia, there are 2 ways of pronouncing it, as you know. And the perception is, if you're saying it with a long A, Appalachia, the perception is that you are an outsider. You're not from the region. It's not considered by most people the correct way to say Appalachia, right? With the long
Right.
And when you talked about the shibboleth, and I want you to talk about that and the history of the shibboleth, I think you're giving a name to what we're doing there with the short and long vowel. And I grew up, because everybody around me was like this, I grew up like, oh, it's never latcha, it's always latcha, and it's been commodified. It's on T-shirts, and they have a saying that if you say it wrong, they'll throw an Appalachia, that kind of thing. But then I learned that there are people in pockets of Appalachia who were born and raised, say, with the long A, and they consider themselves Appalachia too. There are fewer people say that than short A. But is that what you would consider a shibboleth?
Absolutely. So a shibboleth is really any pronunciation, usually of a specific word, that instantly identifies you as either an in-group member or an out-group member. So, are you from here? Are you part of this group? Or are you not? And just having someone say that word tells you everything you need to know about that. And I'd say Appalachia is absolutely that. It's funny because I actually grew up saying Appalachia, but out west, people often say the other form, which feels wrong to me to even say, or they'll say Appalachia, a lot of times, not Appalachia. I can't even say the other one, Appalachia. Feels wrong.
Yeah.
And then it made me start to doubt my own. I was like, what? What? Where did I get that from? And then I realized, it really is. Like Kirk Hazen, who's also a linguist who has worked with Appalachian speech, did a study where he was, trying to figure out where people say those two differently. And, a lot of people do say Appalachia or Appalachia, but they tend not to be from the southern part of Appalachia. And some people that are from Appalachia up north say it the other way as well. So it's not that there's a right or wrong, but really there's a in-group or an out-group marked from that. And if you're from Appalachia, it's not just about a place in geographic terms, it's about a space in social terms. And that pronunciation marks you as a member of a group that belongs in that social space.
You write about, it has its roots in the Bible, actually, this idea of a shibboleth and life or death situations. Can you talk about that?
Sure. I mean, the word shibboleth is actually a Hebrew word that means stream or ear of corn. There's different dialect variants of it, but the story is in the book of Judges, where you had two warring Israelite clans. So you had the Ephraimites and the Gileadites, and they were upset with one another. And so they were basically at war, and the Gileadites were a fiercer tribe, and they sort of smote the Ephraimites, who then tried to retreat back across the River Jordan because that's where their homeland was. But the Gileadites got there faster. And so they stood at the folds of the River Jordan where everybody had to cross if they wanted passage. And they basically, looked similar. Both clans looked similar, so they couldn't tell from looking at you which group you belonged to. But they had them say the word shibboleth, which meant stream at the time, to cross the stream. And they would kill people that said it with the Ephraimite pronunciation, because that one word would tell people which tribe you belong to. So if you said shibboleth with a S instead of shibboleth, they knew that you were a member of the Ephraimite tribe, and they actually killed thousands of Ephraimites in that way. And that's not the only time that we hear of a shibboleth that had life or death consequences. That's actually where we get the word from, was the biblical story. But there was a horrible period in the Dominican Republic's history where a ruler actually killed people if they said the Spanish word for parsley, which I'm actually really bad at pronouncing, so I'm not even going to try it. But it has an R in it. And there's a Dominican pronunciation of R, and then there's a Haitian pronunciation of R. And at that time, there were a lot of Haitian immigrants in the Dominican Republic. And so again, they killed thousands, tens of thousands actually of Haitians based on the pronunciation of that one word alone. So, luckily, most of the time, we're not killing people because of the way they say things. These shibboleths are more just marking us as members of a group. But it has been throughout history that the way we pronounce things sort of stands us apart or together with other people. And I think there's a good lesson in that and a bad lesson in that. The good lesson is, speech bonds us. And it can really make us see who belongs to the same experiences and backgrounds as we do and make us feel closer to them. But the bad thing is we're also very judgy about hearing differences in ways that are incredibly negative. And, it doesn't always end in death, but it can kill professional opportunities and social opportunities and also just makes people feel really bad about themselves. And so I think, we always have to tread carefully on that line between celebrating the fact that we're different because it bonds us to people and not being evaluative of the fact that, yes, they're different, but that doesn't make them less than what we are.
Yes, very well said, because it is a really touchy subject in many parts of Appalachia with many people. They're very protective of the way that they say it. I want to go back in history because I'm so fascinated by the roots of American Englishes and how all of this developed. And in particular in Appalachia, there's been this rumor since the 19th century that Appalachian people speak Elizabethan English, that our dialect is Shakespearean. And I understand why. I think a lot of it, when I see it pop up online from time to time, it's still something that people pass around or like to say. I understand it. It's a really romantic idea. And if Shakespeare or British literature is the high bar for, intelligence or being correct, then you're going to want to associate. And if your dialects are stigmatized, you're going to want to associate something positive with it. Let me pause here and say that you do write that the colonists probably did sound Shakespearean.
Yes. I mean, the colonists in certain parts that came in the 1700s, they were Shakespearean in the sense that they were also spoke Elizabethan English because that was the era, right, that Shakespeare was writing. And so his accent would have been similar to a good portion of settlers that came to what would become the United States at that time period. Of course, in the Appalachian area, there actually is a lot of North and North Midland British settlement. So they would have sounded different than Shakespeare because Shakespeare was more of a Southern British English speaker. But it was still from that same era. And a lot of the features that we tend to think of as particularly Southern or Appalachian now that are unique were actually shared by settlers across the colonies at that time. And I think what people are trying to capture in that sort of Shakespearean English, or, there's a famous study on that question called Shakespeare in the Holler, which is sort of that idea. There are two different things. There's the idea that there are some relic features that exist in Appalachian Englishes that are not found elsewhere. That doesn't mean, though, that there aren't relic features everywhere in the United States in Englishes spoken here. There are, but they tend to be more shared across Englishes than the ones that we specifically find in Appalachian English. It's also sort of an attempt to kind of eradicate this faulty belief that somehow Appalachian English is backwards and sort of a decayed version of English. And I think that's really where it got a lot of its impetus. And I think that's a wonderful reason to have that sort of myth. But it is exactly that. It's a myth because in all cases, while there might be a few relic features like a prefixing, for example, is from a really old English feature called on locatives. So I'm a hunting and a fishing, which is sort of a stereotypical Appalachian English feature. That's actually from I'm on hunting, on fishing, which you would have heard in the Old English period. So that's a relic feature. And then it was shared also by Scots-Irish. And, you end up with a long-term sort of remnant of that in the way that we shorten on to But that doesn't mean there's not, a lot of new novelty that has also developed. And so there's very little in any American English that you could say is Shakespearean. And there's, in fact, very little in British English that you would say was Shakespearean. So it's just a fallacy more generally because language changes so much over time. And I doubt anybody in school in Appalachia has an easier time reading Romeo and Juliet than my daughter did up in the West, right? Rhotic
and non-rhotic.
Yeah.
Because Virginia is that state. Because we have the Appalachian side and because we have everything else, right? And everything, of course, it's complex because you've got urbanization and you've got people coming in and coming out. I've lived in different parts than this part, and I know that there's a lot of R-lessness in Southside. There's R-lessness in the Richmond area. There's R-lessness in Tidewater. But on the Appalachian side, it's R-fullness. And that's because of settlement patterns, correct?
Right, absolutely. First, I'm curious, because I think your husband's from Richmond, correct?
From Chesterfield.
Is he R-less or no?
He's not R-less, no. But I have heard, having been there so much, I have heard different people. My ear picked up on the R-lessness in different...
Right.
Yeah.
I think it's a receding feature. That's why I asked, because, as we're finding more generally a lot of Southern, sort of classically Southern features, a lot of them sort of coastal Southern features are showing up less in younger generations. And a lot of that is because of this in-migration and out-migration that has really sort of linguistically swamped parts of the South. Where we find less of that happening is more rural areas or inland areas where you don't tend to get, or less urban areas where you don't tend to get that same level of migration, and where Southern identity and culture tends to thrive in a way it doesn't in a lot of these urban areas that have become so swamped. Yes, I mean, what's really fascinating about R-lessness is people tend to think of it in, just like, oh, it's an accent feature, and isn't that quaint? Or, we have these ideas like, okay, you often use R-less speech or non-rhotic speech, we call it, in places like London, and then Boston, and then New York, and then the coastal South, like Richmond and Charleston. But then we don't even see how they're related to each other. And they do seem arbitrary, right? Why would you have it in these places? But actually what they all have in common is that they come from essentially the same root. They're all from the same people that spread that R-lessness with them. But to start at the very beginning, when most of the colonies were originally settled by the British in the 17th century, so the early 1600s, Jamestown the first, right? But then you also had Boston about 15 years later or so. There was R everywhere. So we didn't have R-lessness in London at that time. So the Queen's English would have had R in it at that time. The only places we see a little bit of R-lessness where weakening of R had started to occur by the 16th century is in certain words before S. So the word curse and the word burst, for example, the reason we have words like cuss and bust is because those are actually the R-less versions of what used to be pronounced curse and burst. But actually at the time when the settlers came, even in the 17th century, those words had often lost their R. So that was like the very kind of twinkle of R dropping that happened probably by starting around the 16th century. But it's not really to the 18th century in Britain that we start to see R dropping and R weakening really commented on and obviously be so pervasive that people were trying to stamp it out. And it was considered a not good feature at that time. So it was kind of a vulgar feature. In fact, you see writings that call it a vulgar feature from that era and saying that, people should put their R's back in. And this was particularly prevalent in the southern part of England, especially London. But at that time, most of the British colonists that had landed in Jamestown and Boston, or Plymouth, had their R's. And then you had in the late 1700s in the Pennsylvania colony, you had northern and North Midland British settlers that were mostly the Quakers, and they all had their R's through the period. So they never dropped their R's, even later when London was doing it. And then you had the Scots-Irish who have that really strong R. And then you had the Irish, who also have a pretty strong R. So you had in Pennsylvania, which was kind of the root of Appalachian settlement later on, that's where you get this really strong R-producing tendency. And so the heartland of America has always had its R. Then it's really in the 19th century, because everywhere else in the United States at that point still had R, even Virginia, even North New England. But in the 19th century, as R dropping switched from being vulgar to prestigious in London, so in the 18th century, you had R dropping, but it was kind of vulgar. By the 19th century, even the hoity-toity in London were doing it. So then everybody's like, let's all drop our R. It sounds great. Let's become non-rhotic, they called it. So people didn't do it consciously, but it got picked up because it was so pervasive at that time. And then it started to get a good quality. People thought it sounded good, which shows you how arbitrary our evaluations of speech are, right? Because it goes from bad to good. And then everybody started doing it, and that became the model of speech in Britain, right? This London cultural prestige was radiating far. Well, in New England and the coastal colonies, particularly Charleston and Virginia, that contact with London continued. So a lot of Southerners sent their children back for education. There were also a lot of constant stream of boats coming back and forth where people would go back easily to Britain. I mean, as easy as travel by sea was at that time, and then have people from Britain come over, especially London. And so what they were constantly exposed to was arless prestige speech in London in the 19th century. That's what got picked up in New England and the coastal South. So again, it's that same sort of kind of root or origin for arlessness, both in New England and the coastal South, even though they didn't get it from each other, they all got it from London. And that's when, you see the spread across the Great Lakes of New England settlers that brought that down to areas like New York, which is, again, where you see arlessness, again, from the same origin. And so what happened, though, is when you get the spread of the Midland colonies, the Pennsylvania colony, down through inland Pennsylvania, inland Virginia, and into the upper South and Midland South, that's where you get full R's being pronounced because it was Scots-Irish, the Irish and North Midland settlers, all of whom always had their R's and never lost them and had no interest in losing them or hanging out in London. And so that's why you have this sort of split in Virginia, because you got the sort of Pennsylvania stream going on the inland side of Virginia. And then you had the coastal stream that often had a lot of contact with London on the external side of Virginia. And it had a dialect divide in between where roticity and non-roticity sort of were side by side because of those very different historic settlement patterns.
So is it true to say landscape and industry also fit into that? Because in the Appalachian Mountains, it's very rocky, mountainous terrain, and people were not coming and going. They were not for the most part, very few wealthy people, but you had the aristocracy and the wealthy people who built the plantations in flatland. Virginia, for example, they were coming and going and wanted to maintain that prestigious connection. Right.
We always see these, our social networks are what determine how we sound. And those social networks are critically dependent on our patterns of interaction that are determined by things like economy, ethnicity, sort of class, all those types of factors that will sort of determine who we look to as our model and who we interact in daily life. And those people are the ones that help foster dialect formation or accent formation. So if you're really sort of aspiring to a certain kind of stature and you are going back to Britain and you're looking to that as your model, you're going to start to sound more like people there and then bring that home with you. And then everybody you're talking to will sound that way. But you could give a crap about those London snobs, right? When you're in London, actually the Scots-Irish really kind of despised the British government and then its emissaries, right? Anybody who sort of held up the sort of British crown and this sort of repressive government that they had put on the Scots-Irish. They sure as heck didn't want to sound like anybody back in London. And there was a huge, immense. I mean, it wasn't. It's about 50% when I looked at this study, like Michael Montgomery's work. It's about 50% British and 50% Scots-Irish and Appalachian kind of background. But it was a really significant part of the ideology of that region. And certainly going back to London or modeling your speech off of anybody on the coast that was part of the aristocracy that you had tried to leave behind was not going to be something you wanted to do. But it also was geography, very certainly, because a lot of the reasons that you didn't get people from the coastal South pushing inland, and it was a really hostile, wild environment. And, if you had a cush life on the coast, why would you bother? But if you were trying to get freedom and land and, had a vision, you had the courage to do it. And that's what we find with the Midland colonies and the Scots-Irish. They pushed into the interior. And so geography was a big reason why you don't get a lot of mixing. So, economy, geography, ideology, belief in what you wanted out of this new world, all of those things factor into who you hang out with, and who you hang out with is what determines your accent.
This is also fascinating, and we just sort of skimmed the surface of your wonderful book, Why We Talk Funny, and I want to encourage my audience to run out and get a copy for your summer reading, and you write about it in a way that is not, if the word linguistics is scary for people, you write about this for a non-specialist audience. So that's why it's so good, because it's such interesting reading. It's easy to follow. You touch on some things, but I love that because you're teaching people the names for why we do things.
Right. I'm not trying to give anybody a linguistics class. Well, pretty much like kind of stray person like me and you, but mostly, no, I'm so happy to hear you say that, because it was really my goal to make something that generally doesn't get talked about, which is sort of the phonology and phonetics, to use fancy words, of accent, because it's tough and it's complex, but it's super important to understand ideas from that, to understand the history and the origin and the development of accents. But we don't talk about it much, because as linguists, we're like, oh, wow, that's too complex. No one wants to hear it. So it was my goal in writing that book to see, can I write about this in a way that's fun and it's fascinating without being, like, oh my God, I don't want this lesson here, and there's the test at the end. So it makes me happy that you say that. So I'm very grateful.
Dr. Valerie Fridland, thank you so much for being on the Talkin' Appalachian podcast. It was a pleasure.
Absolutely. I love your podcast. So it was a joy to be here.